So I'm going to talk through how we build the IAP Roadmap Timeline. We've seen the example that I shared during the IAP Roadmaps sessions that we've done for DigiPlace. And I'm going to talk through now how we start and how we build one of these things. So we've just seen the example where it's populated, and that potentially looks a little bit scary and like there's a lot of work to do. Actually, I'm going to show how we build it up and how we can put it together over time, and how it's quite it's a lot more simple than you might think to put these things together. So as a quick recap then, this is the sort of timeline grid in Miro, and the advantage of doing it in Miro is that it's actually a bit quicker and easier to lay it out visually. We can export it as a PDF or as an image file if we want to share it. And also it makes it easier for myself and other partners to be able to see what you're working on and sort of share timelines across partners in an active way. You could also, if you wish, use Miro to build it with your ULG if that's something that's helpful, but that's not required, obviously. One of the other advantages is that we can zoom out to this full view like this, so we can see the whole timeline. And once we've populated though, we can zoom in quite easily to see fine detail, which we can add in if we want to. So the basic grid then, we've got months across the top from basically about now through to December 21. Now I haven't put the final 9 months of DigiPlace on this timeline yet, so the months for 2022 we're not going to worry about at the moment, and we can deal with the detail of that a little bit later because I wanted to focus on the first part at the moment. As I've explained before, 4 streams across the timeline. One where we capture and note outputs and milestones, things that will produce or milestones that will reach during the project. A line for activities, so they're sort of top level things that we will do as part of creating our IAP. Next is the ULG contribution and the ULG meetings and work, so we'll capture and illustrate where those things are happening. And finally at the bottom we've got the links to the transnational work. DigiPlace sessions or URBACT program level work. So the first thing I would say is that we can build this up bit by bit. We can first of all go into look at the milestones and the outputs, so just map out what we think those are going to be. We're going to build the activities we need to deliver those outputs to reach those milestones. We're then going to map how the ULG meetings and activity will contribute to those activities. The transnational links you don't need to worry about. So if I zoom in, I've added in here to say that this row will be maintained by myself and or Messina. Don't need to worry about updating this. I'll update that because it's obviously fixed for everybody. So that'll be pre-populated on your version of the timeline. And to that end then, and as a starting point, just to put some things that we already know. So I've already copied, I'm just going to paste in the things we already know in relation to some of the transnational work. So I'll just position that roughly in the right place here. So we know that we have got a DigiPlace session scheduled for the 8th of September. We also know we're in the process of arranging individual sessions with myself and each of you individually in around that similar period. We know the dates for the URBACT eUniversity between middle of September and middle of October, and we know that at some point around here we will have another DigiPlace transnational cluster of sessions online at the back end of November or early December. We'll probably also have 1 or 2 DigiPlace smaller sessions in between these two things as well. Now we originally had planned, just to note, a DigiPlace transnational cluster in here. Talking with Dino and colleagues, we think it's probably not feasible to fit in a full transnational cluster during this e-university period. It will just be too much. So we might have a couple of extra individual short sessions in there for DigiPlace, but we're still working that out as we work out how we replan around the e-university sessions, because they need to be prioritized. So that's some things to work around as a starting point. We can obviously then populate that we know there will be further things later through 21. So we can start to build up some of those things, but I will provide you with a pre-populated version of the transnational content. So what do we need to do in terms of you as a city then for populating your roadmap? So obviously you need to be thinking about how the overall flow of the activities is structured. Now we've talked previously about this framework that I've copied into here that we talked about in terms of moving through the general stages, defining context, analysing problems, defining vision, objectives, ideas, and so on. And there's also been the flowchart, which just shows how we move through those things. And that just provides us with a bit of shape and structure to how we're going to approach things. So at a very basic level, we can take the framework and the flow of this framework, and the most basic level of your roadmap is effectively looking at these stages. So if we position these stages on the timeline, and I'm choosing to position them on this line between activities and the ULG meetings, just because I find it's the easiest place to illustrate it. You have the flow across the middle. If we put each of these where we sort of starting that stage of work, so that it doesn't fill up the whole space, but just goes on the start of that phase, we look at something like this. The context work's already ongoing. I'm going to just work on the basis that we haven't done any problem definition work, and all of the content from most of these stages will be covered to some degree in the IAP University. So I'm going to, for the sake of argument here, say we're going to start for this roadmap, start the problem analysis work after we've done the problem exploration work as part of the university, which will be early on. So we can start that then. If that's going to take say a couple of months to go through and do the proper detailed problem analysis, we'll be moving to the work on to find a vision around this point here, which would mean we'd be having our vision completed, sake of argument, by say end of December. If I move these things further on, that would mean our defined specific objectives are being defined in January. And we can then move through each of the sessions. Now we know that we need to have our draft integrated action plan by December 2021. That's that first draft by then. That's an IAP milestone. So to prepare that in time for then, we wanted to get on with our draft at the latest by the start of November to give us some time to finalise that draft. So these other things would fit in between that. Defining our specific objectives, we then move to creating ideas for how we could meet those things and different ideas to try out. We then define those into, work those up into formal actions, identify some to test and start working on those tests. And then when we've got the results of the test projects, any small scale actions that have produced specific insights or results or data, we can then refine our actions and move to the draft action plan. So on a very basic level, that is your most rudimentary DigiPlace roadmap. So it just shows you across the time scale how roughly we're going to approach this. Now, that's a little bit simplistic, but at least it does give us some basic information. We can think about the fact, for example, that if we're starting pilot small-scale actions around this point, we could think that will be running over the summer period. So if we end up slipping and the scheduling is a little bit later, we might have to end up slipping a long way back because we don't want to start them in the summer period, for example. Likewise, if we've got elections in April 2021, for example, that might affect the resources or the focus we can have on things that particular period. So again, it just gives us an ability to see where things are. So that gives us the basic shape. The next thing we can think about is the outputs and milestones. What do we need to do along here? What are the things we need to hit? In terms of adding sticky notes, you can either select one from the right colour from the side and just click where you want it and then move it around, or you can copy and paste one from the right colour here. I've tried to colour code them so it makes it easy to see what's happening. So one of the first milestones we have is we know that we'll get to a point where we've got the ULG is consolidated. So we can say if that's going to happen before we get properly into the autumn, we could have the ULG consolidated by this point. Say a target to have that done before the end of September. We also might say another major milestone we want to hit is saying we want to have by the end of the year, we might say we want to have our vision agreed. So we might say that's a milestone we're going to hit from there. And we also know right at the far end is that we want to have, let's add another one here. We know that by this point we have a milestone somewhere that we have our draft IAP is complete. That's the milestone we're aiming for by the end of 2021. So what about some of the outputs and products that we're going to create in there? And to do that, so we know in order to do this, we can start to put some of the products together. So from the problem definition work, we know that what we will have is some defined problems, some documented problem definition saying this is what we're going to specifically work on, and that will appear towards the end of that problem definition work. We also know, therefore, that we're going, after the visioning work, we will, and the point we've got the vision agreed, we will have created as a product, as an output, our DigiPlace vision. So in the same way, we can start to build out and just map out where some of these outputs are. Now, I'm dropping these on roughly where they look as a starting point because it gives us our starting shape. But having got them on there, we can move them around and we can think about how they fit in terms of time frame, how they clash with other things, or what resources may or may not be available. So once things are there, we can move these things around relatively easily. The first stage is to get the things on the chart in a rough place. If you're not quite sure, take a guess at the starting point because we can refine it as we go. And so we can work on through with the different outputs, having got vision. We know that we then also will get to a point where we'll have some specific objectives. So we'll know that's the sort of for DigiPlace. We'll have some specific objectives that are shaping our action plan, and that will appear towards the end of this objectives phase here. And then we move into ideas, which will produce some particular outputs in terms of different ideas. Actions will produce some draft possible actions, etc., etc., etc. And so we can work through and populate these things here. What I'm going to do for the moment is just focus on these sort of first 4 sections, just to work through, just to illustrate it. So we've got that kind of, these are kind of the headline things. It just gives us a sense of, for example, by this plan, that we're saying that by the end of January, we'll have our specific objectives defined, which means that by the end of December, we want our vision defined. And we can work backwards and just sense check. Does this all make sense? Is it realistic for us to get to that point there? And we can then think about what activities do we need in order to deliver that. So let's add the right color sticky in here. So we know that we have some stakeholder mapping and analysis to do, and we'll, to some degree, have done some of that already. We might have a bit more we want to do as we go through, for example. We also might have some specific work to do in terms of activities to consolidate our ULG. So we might have some particular activities we're doing here to sort of finalize what it is we need to do. We've also, in order to do that, we might think actually we also need to do our ULG checklist, which I have shared as well. So we might need to make sure we've done that by September, so we can ensure that we've got some final, let's pop that in here, to do before September, to do some final consolidation work if it's needed, before we get too far into the problem phase or too far into the university. So that's some initial activities we might have. We might need to decide we actually need to do a little bit of extra work in terms of clarifying our local needs and any challenges we're trying to tackle. So finalising and reviewing the context and say, right, we're really clear on our stakeholders now, and now we're also clear on the needs and challenges that we've got. And so things, a long list of problems that we want to try and tackle. In terms of the problem analysis work, and we'll go through this in some university and in some of our DigiPlace sessions, but we will need to do some detailed problem analysis work. So that will need to happen during the problem phase. And as part of that, we might also think we want to do some gathering of data and evidence. So how do we make sure that we're saying that we're clear, we understand what these problems are, how they manifest themselves, who's affected, and so on. So there's those sort of activities will need to happen in the problems phase. There's obviously then some work, it's a slightly obvious statement, but there's some work to do to then create the vision. So we need to make sure we've got, and that we actually have to do some work to do that. It could be done in different ways, but that's one of the activities we'll have to do in this phase. Likewise, we shall also have to define our there's work to do, activities to do to define our specific Typing and talking at the same time. Not always my forte. There we go. So we know that we have to have an activity to do some specific objectives. So again, that kind of gives us a rough shape to work through, and kind of starts to give us a picture of what some of the things are. Now, in some ways this is quite high level, but you might find that for what you need, actually that's fine. That gives us a sense of where things are happening. These are the sort of steps you're going to go through, and actually at DigiPlace level, just us having the visibility of this part of the project, for example, it's just helpful to understand where you're going to be doing things, where you're going to be focusing on different bits, where you might need support or want to exchange on particular areas, and how this all fits in with the transnational work we're planning. And if you want to add further detail to this, you can obviously start to add smaller text or smaller post-its, and we can zoom in to this and sort of add things smaller in here that we can have particular detail. I'll go into that in a separate video. Or we can zoom out and we can see the whole picture of how it's building up. So having got our sort of main targets, in terms of our outputs we're aiming at, the milestones we're aiming at, and then some of the activities we've got mapped across the stages of the general framework. We also then think about ULG meetings and ULG activity. What does that look like? So we know if we've got this DigiPlace session scheduled for the 8th of September, we could say, for the sake of argument, we might want to schedule a ULG meeting in here. ULG meeting. Sake, for example, on the 10th of September, because we know we want to have a bit of a debrief from the DigiPlace session and from any individual session, and we also want to prepare for the university. So we might put a ULG meeting in there for that. We might also then say, we know we might want another ULG meeting here, because we want to debrief the summer university, back to university, that's what EUE means. So we might have a debrief meeting in here, which might also serve to feed into our transnational cluster, for example. So you can start to see how you can think about where the ULG meetings are falling. This one might also want to think about initiating problem definition activity. But it might be, and this is just an example, but it might be that you have a working group in here to do the problem analysis, and that's one way of approaching it, is one of the ULG models, and that could be a subset of the ULG members forming a working group, or also bringing in other specific skills or specific people to help work on the detailed work to define that. So we might have a working group in there. Equally, we might have another bit of working group activity, either the same group or a different group. To say this is just for an example, but we might have a working group on the vision and the details of the vision in this period, and you might use this meeting to sort of provide the mandate for that working group and so on. And that sort of approach can carry on through. Now, what we can do with the ULG meetings is we know that we're going to have meetings at a certain frequency and a certain regularity, and this is one of the things I've asked you to think about in your terms of reference for your local group, for your ULG. But we can start to think, if we add a few in here, we can start to plot out roughly where we think these might be. Now, if we're talking, sake of argument, one of the recommendations is about every 6 weeks for your meeting. Now, I appreciate it depends on your exact circumstances, the numbers in your group, how you're meeting, how easy it is to convene people, how long your meetings are. All these things affect the frequency. But just working on roughly 6 to 8 weeks for each meeting. If we're having one here, then we probably also will be aiming to have one at this point here before the end of the year, to debrief probably from the DigiPlace cluster, and probably to review and sign off the vision, for example, if that's your aim. You then might have another one here to consolidate that vision and kick off and do some of the detailed work on the specific objectives. And then 6 weeks further on from that, you might have one here in the idea stage to initiate. If you're running an open call for ideas or doing some idea generation with your ULG group, you might be doing that and so on. So you can start to plot it out. But then that's helpful to do, because you can start to think, how, if we're initiating this stage or this stage or this stage, where do we need a meeting around that time, or do we need a couple of meetings on top of each other in quick succession? And what does that look like in terms of resource and feasibility? So by doing this, we can just start to plot out what the shape of things are going to look like. Obviously, this far in advance, you don't necessarily need to have a fixed date for a year's time, but you just need to know that roughly you want to be having a meeting in different areas. If it's difficult to meet over the summer, for example, you might need to think about, okay, we want one at the beginning of September because we're going to be refining and collecting all our insights from our tests. And are we okay having a big gap here, or do we need to move this into this time here? These are all the debates you can have once you start to see what the program looks like and so on. But that's just to give you an idea of how you can start to build these things up. So you can see what we've got here is quite quickly we've got actually simple enough but clear representation of how these things are moving through. We know the stages we're going through, we've got the activities we're going to be doing as part of these stages, we've got the ULG work and contributions, that are parts that help these activities and fit in with that. We can see what milestones we're aiming for and what products and outputs we're producing as part of this work, and then we can see how that fits in across the transnational work which we mapped out across here. So as you can see, it doesn't take very long to start to build these things together. And actually these things I'm talking about here are probably things that you're going to do as part of this phase. So if you wish to, you can use these prompts as a basis for building your IAP roadmap for yourselves. It's not to say you have to structure it in exactly this way, but this gives you a kind of an off-the-shelf way of starting to build it together and starting to illustrate it. And the idea being that we have one of these in Miro for every project partner for DigiPlace, so that we've got 8 versions of the journey to your action plan. Now, different cities will want to run at different speeds, so this is purely illustrative, and it's making the assumption that you haven't yet started any real work on your problem definition in any great detail. But it could be you say, well, actually we've done most of that and we want to go faster, so we could be saying that for our city, we're saying, well, we've already done all the problem definition. Now here's just a quirk. Sometimes when you click things and it's using one of these grids that the timeline is on, all the pictures disappear. If that does happen, all you just need to do is scroll that bit off the screen and come back and they reappear. Don't panic if that suddenly happens. Sorry, what was I saying? So yeah, you might see we've already done most of the problem definition and we've got clearly documented problem definitions, and actually we don't need to revisit that. We're completely confident it fits with the AIRBAC methodology and everything. And so we might compress all these things up. So at that stage, you can, I'll do it all in one go, we can say all of this lot here can come forwards. Oops, sorry, select everything. All of this lot can all come forward. So we can say we've already done all these things, and we can get straight on in September with our visioning work and our objectives. So we'll aim to have our specific objectives, as we know all this is already done. Which would therefore imply that our ULG is already consolidated as well. So all this will go all the way forwards to here, and we're going to have our specific objectives done before December, which means we can move to ideas in January, for example. So you can move these things around based on your own particular circumstances. Now, some of you, I think, will be thinking you are in this position and you've already done all of this and we've got a vision, all the rest of it. The thing I would just remind you is that one of the challenges we'll be looking at in this period here is, do we actually have a solid vision? If you remember back in one of the sessions we did on the IAP roadmap, I said the problem phase is one of the ones that gets skipped over most and missed out most, and people don't do it in as much detail as they should, and that leads to problems further down the line when you're actually starting to do this, because you realize you've not really got a clear view on what you wanted to tackle and you've gone off at a tangent that isn't delivering something that you really want. So I am going to be talking to everybody about whether we have clear defined problems, whether we've got clearly defined and agreed visions. And I don't mean here a reminder, a vision at city level necessarily. It's about a vision for DigiPlace, for the DigiPlace action plan. What's that going to create? So just a reminder. But you might be in that position, and that's, if you are, that's great. We can move faster. So I'm just highlighting that to say that there are different situations and different speeds that people and different cities might go at, and that's quite all right. You may want to spend until December building your IAP roadmap. If you've got a lot of work to consolidate your ULG and revisit your context, we might find that all of this actually goes much further this way, and you're not really starting off on your problem definition until until late November, early December, and that's fine. So the only thing we have to make sure we hit is that the IAP roadmap is delivered by December. But if you want to spend until December doing that, bear in mind that means you probably won't be starting these things until this sort of time here. You can't get very far through the problems definition at all without having your roadmap planned out. Just to bear that in mind. So that's the way we can build these things up anyway. So that gives you just an idea around how this sort of stuff can be pieced together. I'll just move that back to roughly where we were originally. And you can obviously move all the way through here and plan out your objectives and so on through this way, and your activities and your ULG. And I say I will populate this bit. And that will give you something that might look a bit more like this in a bit more detail, where you've got activities and stages all the way through, some ULG meetings plotted out all the way through, a high-level set of outputs that you've got defined. And some of the earlier things here, you might have a bit more detail about some of the activity, or you might have a bit more detail about what your ULG meeting is going to be or what date it's on. But it gives you a rough shape. Now, in reality, getting to this stage hasn't taken very long. Yes, there is some thinking to do behind it, so it's easy enough for me to drop the things on there. But my point is the process of adding it to this template shouldn't need to take a huge amount of time. The thinking behind building it might take a bit more time, but it's something you need to be doing anyway. The other last thing to mention is obviously this timeline works in parallel with the outline table, which I've got the template in the Word document, which is being shared along with the roadmap timeline, this document here. So that is more text-based and can collect a little bit more information in one place, but isn't quite as visual. But that gives you some of the prompts just to sort of set out your main thinking around the different bits and how the ULG is involved in each thing and so on. So just to say, remember that the timeline is built in conjunction with that. You can start with the timeline and then populate the table, or if you prefer to work the other way, you can populate the table and then populate the timeline. They do cover slightly different bits of information and help to look at it in a slightly different way. But you can start with either of them, depending on how you prefer to work. I think when we talked about it in the transnational cluster, most of you said that you like to use both, but you might have a preference as to where you start, or you might do stage by stage. You might do the problem stage on the timeline, then flick across to the document and do the problem stage in the document. It's as you like. So that hopefully clears the way to show you how to put this thing together. It's easiest to do it with sticky notes in Miro. Rather, you can use the shapes as well if you prefer, but the sticky notes are easiest to move around and are sort of the most intuitive without having to get into too many different bits of formatting. If you do have any problems with it, you can obviously get in touch and I will help work through that. Again, the advantage if you're doing it in Miro is that I can drop in live with you whilst talking to you, and we can look at stuff and we can shape it. Great, so I will do a further video to go into some of the more details of Miro. If you really want to enrich in this timeline, we can do that. It's not essential, but if you actually like it as a working tool, which I know some people certainly use this sort of thing as a working tool, we can go in. I'll do a separate video to go into some of the more detailed functions to work through. But that should be enough to get you going and to give you the understanding of how to, basic level, how to put that all together. Okay, great.